Finding your photographic style is a bit like a band finding their sound. Supposedly, it's the most important thing in the world to an artist. It differentiates you from your peers. Your style gives you access to certain cliques, and to a certain degree, lets the world know where and how to identify your work. This mentality relating to photographic style also bleeds over to us, the layperson, amateur photographers or hobbyists. The majority of us aren't professional photographers, full-time artists or content creators. Yet we are told our work only has meaning if the algorithm likes it or if you fit in to certain style criteria. Fitting in and having a photographic style shouldn't really bother us. We take photos for selfish reasons. We take pictures because we enjoy it. But there's always that voice in the back of our heads that just asks the question, so what is your photographic style? Whilst there are videos online that you can watch, books that you can purchase and blogs that you can read on how you find your style, I'm going to break it down for you today in one sentence. Just look at the photos you've already taken and make a connection. For the longest time, I struggled with finding my style. As a previous film photographer, I thought the medium of film was my style. This isn't really the case, especially now when film is having such a massive resurgence. You need to look a little bit deeper than at the surface level. It's only now in 2025 that I've started to see a connection in my work and where my style potentially is and where it could go in the future. So I've changed things up quite drastically this past year. I'm no longer shooting with large system cameras anymore. I'm not shooting as much film as I used to. I feel more comfortable when I've got a small compact point and shoot. I've opened myself up to shooting more colour, and yeah, I've started to buy more photo books and stuff like that to actually sort of study going forwards. It's also worth mentioning that I've broadened my horizons a little bit when it comes to photographic genres. For the longest time, and to a certain degree, I still hold this opinion, but I don't really like modern street photography. It's always had a sort of weird cult-like following for me, and it doesn't really sit right with me. You can see this especially in, say, editing techniques or even like a cult of personality. Gildan, for example, whilst his work is very influential, in recent years I've seen many copycats emerge which don't necessarily emulate his photographic style, but more so rip it off, or to create a lesser version of what has already been captured. I can sort of say the same thing for certain branded groups as well. So say for example, Sony Alpha shooters. Sony Alpha street photographers typically take photos that are underexposed of a particular cityscape with blue and orange colour grades featuring a long exposure of a bus, car or urban environment. Whilst it's all very well and good to have these photographic groups, if there's no difference or ambition to try new things, then there's no real sense of individualism within the group itself. You create work like us, and we create work like you, and nobody gets hurt. That said, I do love the street photography of old. Ernst Haas and Saul Leiter being two of my favourites. They didn't do street photography in a conventional manner, and the images that they took for their personal work were very different to what they did in their professional lives. Haas was a commercial photographer and photojournalist, whereas Leiter was an editorial photographer. I would say that one can see the through line of Haas's work through texture, pattern, shape and contrast. This is most evident in his photographs of ripped posters, cracking paint and general wear and tear. Texture can also be seen compositionally, but you can also see texture in the form of a long exposure of the dancers that he photographed in New York in 1960. Leiter, on the other hand, focused more on real life with an abstract twist. His use of negative space allows us to get a glimpse of what's happening, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Another way of withholding information is that light is shot through condensation on windows or through reflections. The images give us a rough idea of what's going on beyond the glass, but not enough to know for certain. There are other light tells, such as his use of longer lenses and his love of the colour red. But that's enough ego polishing for the greats. What about me? Whilst I briefly spoke about it in my New Year, New Gear video, I love my GR3 purely for longer exposure shots. For similar reasons as Leiter and Haas, it just gives a little bit more texture to an image and makes perhaps a more dull image appear more lifelike and lively. Whilst I do use my GR primarily for this style nowadays, I did come across it completely accidentally. When on holiday in Sweden, I took this photo. I moved from being out in the open to being in the shade with my ISO set to 200 and my aperture set around f8. I heard a jogger running from behind me down the avenue of trees. I thought it could make a good photo. I lifted my camera and snapped a frame whilst continuing to walk, which resulted in my shutter speed dropping to around a 30th of a second. Whilst I was a little bit confused at first, I forgot that I was shooting manual ISO. I instantly fell in love with the image. We both know that it was someone going for a jog, but to someone viewing the image for the first time, they may have questions such as, where are they? Who or what are they running from? Who are they running to? It's also worth mentioning that whilst it does have point light streaks that you'd normally see with conventional long exposures, the movement of the runner and the motion blur creates an almost painterly effect in the image. An exploration of balanced composition, human relationships and loneliness. Another thing that I've noticed is that I tend to photograph people from behind. I don't like confrontation. I don't want to identify them, as in some cases the overall meaning of the photograph could be seen as a prejudice. One of the earliest that I have is from January 2024. I was out in the peaks just to get some New Year's exercise, and I noticed that no end of people, much like myself, were also out there on their own. Whilst there were people hiking and walking about, there were also other people that were just sat or stood doing nothing. What made this even more odd is that they were all at some of the busiest vantage points that look over Surprise View. Whilst I could have filled the frame with the individual, I very much like the figure to be small in the frame to show how much space there is around them and the vast openness that they're looking out into. Thankfully, because of the bright coloured jackets and hats, they are not lost in the frame and it anchors them as the main subject matter. The vastness of space, the overall dreary, wet, dark and dank atmosphere and the smallness of the single figure speaks to me as an image of loneliness. But it doesn't just need to be a single figure in the frame to suggest this. Here's an image that I took in Oslo. It's not dark, it's not devoid of objects, and it contains more than one figure. But if we take a closer look through framing, I was able to photograph these men within their own box, confining them to what they can see out of their respective window. If you really wanted to get pretentious, you could say for the man in the middle that he has a road in view that he can take to go forth into the world, yet he chooses not to look at it, potentially out of fear of travelling alone. 3 is the magic number. As humans, you, me, we like to look for patterns. RGB, 246, stomp stomp clap. What do all these sequences have in common? They require 3 samples to form a pattern. In my images, I tend to look for 3 figure or group compositions. Not only will this balance the composition nicely, but I can also use it as a narrative for the images. For example, the gentleman walking with purpose, whilst he is physically quite close to the couple, emotionally he is completely separated. The couple are moving slower at their own slower pace, holding on to and enjoying each other's time together. Whereas, the gentleman walking at pace is alone, escaping as such his environment. Again, there is a loneliness narrative that runs throughout, but sometimes there are other meanings that one can derive from them. It could symbolise companionship, cooperation when taking on a behemoth, wonder, or in the rarer cases, acceptance in being alone because you can forge your own path and plant yourself in places where the sun does shine. I hope you can see from the analysis of Haas, Leiter, as well as my own reflective review, that a single subject matter, genre, theme or location doesn't make up your photographic style. It's the way in which you use them together to make and output your final image. If you take a look through your photos right now, I guarantee that you will find something that linked X to Z in your images. Once you can recognise these tells, you will know what you can build upon in the future. A jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one.